ladies and gentlemen, we've finally updated the ABX and ABL requirements for characters, for best teams, for best setups, and also for the new max scores, which are big yabba dabba doos at 18 million for ABX and 15 million for ABL. Those are massive scores, and you're probably wondering, Alex, why the hell would I ever go past 7 million? Because there are no new rewards. And that is very true. I don't really have a good answer for you. But for competitive alliances, and the more competitive, obviously, the higher the score, you do need to focus on ABL and ABX. And there is some overlap between finding the best players who want to share Mythic Rifts with you every day, and finding the most competitive players who also want to get high scores in ABX, ABL. It's very, very hard to find players that are very competitive for something cooperative, like, you know, Dimension Rifts, but they're not competitive for anything else. They're not competitive for ABX or ABL or AC or anything like that. So if you're having trouble finding an alliance because you're super casual in every game mode, but you want Mythic Rifts, then maybe it's time you take a look at a game mode like ABX ABL and you focus more in on it. Maybe you already have a lot of the tools and you're just not putting them to use. And you know, this video will help you out for that. So and it makes my whole week actually, because of how good it is. Anyways, that's the intro. Holy crap. Let's get into it, boys. So we basically changed almost everything. Almost everything has been changed since the last time you saw this. Essentially, I would say the only days that didn't change are Combat Hero Day. Moon Knight is still the de facto god for that, despite being a year old already, and despite so many combats coming out, none of them have been able to touch the GOAT. There are alternative teams like Venom, etc., but they're not going to do nearly as well as Moon Knight, especially now that the cap has been lifted from 12 million up to 18 million. That's one of the big sticking points here for why I needed to change these lists, because in the past, right, Moon Knight and Venom could both hit 12 million, especially on something like Silence Day where Venom has a little bit of an advantage, but that was at 12 million. Now with the score up to 18 million, Moon Knight blows Venom and everybody else out of the water. So that needs to be said. And then, of course, down here for Hero Mutant Female, this has not changed because we have not gotten a Hero Mutant Female character. And by the looks of this update with Strife and Cable and Omega Red, we're not going to get any of the females anyways. We're going to get Domino, but there's no way a Tier 3 Domino is going to compete with a Tier 4 Storm. So those 2 days have not changed. Everything else has changed, though. So let's get into it here. Blast Villain, as we know, Magneto, the GOAT, Christmas Magneto, absolutely amazing. He got 2 supports now. Just a month ago, this was bereft of supports. In the past, this would be Cyclops, or I mean, the leadership would be Cyclops. You know what I mean, or whatever. The DPS is still Magneto, even though it says lead and it says DPS. You have to do a little bit of understand it of here, but it would be Cyclops and Red Skull. Cyclops and Red Skull would be here as the supports for Magneto. That's pretty damn bad. Or it would be like, you know, Mr. Sinister or some shit like that, or even Mephisto for the Striker. It was really, really bad. But now it's amazing. You have 2 god tier supports in Enchantress and Mysterio to absolutely juice Magneto to the tits as a Blast Villain. You can also use Mysterio as your DPS if you don't have Magneto, in which case you would swap obviously, if you don't have Magneto, you wouldn't put him on the team. You would put somebody like Cyclops here to buff Mysterio. But yeah, that is the Blast Villain. For no restriction, it's a little bit interesting here. And for no restriction, it shows up multiple times. So we want to talk a little bit more about no restriction because it appears on week 1 and on week 2. And then no restriction also appears in ABL. Now, the best no restriction team is technically Jean Grey with 2 supports. Okay, Jean Grey with 2 supports like Dazzler and Black Cat, like Ghost Panther and Valkyrie. You know, there's quite a few options for you. Morgan Le Fay even. However, here's the thing. In order for Jean Grey to be the best, you need to give her a mighty or a brilliant rage CTP. Not greed CTP, rage CTP. So she has to have a rage in order to be considered at the top of the ABX ABL meta for no restriction. Jean is at the top of the ABX ABL meta for other days that are more specific and have more restrictions, like Universal Female Villain. There's no one that competes with Jean, right? Supergiant's not even close. There's nobody. But for no restrictions specifically, when there's no restrictions, you should only use Jean if she has a rage, a mighty or a brilliant rage. And now I know a lot of you are thinking, Alex, I built my Jean primarily for PvP. I've got an authority on her, I've got a greed on her, I've got an egg on her, whatever. In that case, you want to use a different team. Okay, so just to be clear here, the Jean team only is top for no restriction if you have your Jean built with a rage. Judgment does not count. Has to be rage. Okay? So if you have rage Jean, here are the teams, right? If you don't have rage Jean, then Black Bolt with double support is excellent and is basically the best. You have Morgan, you have Valkyrie. You can also substitute Morgan for Shuri. You can also use a Magneto, Dazzler, Valkyrie team. So you could sort of substitute here Magneto, and then you would substitute in Valkyrie here as a support for Magneto, and you'd use Magneto's lead. So you have quite a few options for no restriction now, but we are long past the days of Loki. Again, Loki had been here for a long time because he was the budget option and because 12 million was the cap, and you could cap with Loki like 2 years ago with just a rage. So it was amazing, but that's not the case anymore. Loki's dead. The cap is 18 million. There's no way he's touching that shit. Universal Hero is a little bit tricky as well because Scarlet Witch seems to still be the de facto best, but some players are able to get a little bit more, but we're talking like not much more with a juiced out, maxed out tier 4 Odin. So if you're going for the absolute max score and you have an unlimited budget, I think you should tier 4 Odin and slap like a brilliant rage on that man. However, just keep in mind you're not getting a lot of value, right? You're only getting a score increase of like 500,000 or maybe like 1 million versus a tier 3 Scarlet Witch. That's just the way it is. Scarlet Witch just continues to dominate. It's inexplicable, but it is what it is. Combat here we already talked about. Moon Knight's the GOAT there. Universal villain, we mentioned Jean Grey again. Jean Grey has to have a rage here for best results. However, even if you don't have a rage, well, no, actually, because it's universal villain, sorry, for universal female villain, it's Jean all the way, regardless of the build. But for universal villain, if you don't have a rage Jean, then Black Bolt becomes the best team with Proxima and Morgan here because it's universal villain, so you can't use all of those other supports like Valkyrie. So we're gonna go ahead and put Black Bolt here just so you guys have a little visual. But yeah, Jean only the best. Only use Jean if she has a rage CTP. So that's sort of clear here. Otherwise, you default to Black Bolt with the double support. Speed hero. This one's going to be interesting. You're probably expecting a lead like Nick Fury, but turns out that Misty Knight lead can be as good or better for Luna. So test it out for yourself, either Nick Fury or Misty Knight, but one of those two leads makes tier 4 Luna schwang and bang. Tier 3 Luna is also amazing, probably still better than tier 4 Spider-Gwen or tier 4 Gamora or whatever. But yeah, you do have some alternate teams here with Fury, Spider-Gwen, and White Fox. And then, of course, you could use Gamora, you could use Shadow Shell, but none of them are as good as the new Speed Queen. But just keep in mind there are a couple of options for lead with Nick Fury and Misty Knight, and I guess Wave if you don't have either of those. But she's like a third. She's clearly in third place for that. Combat villain, Dr. Octopus is the best, but I think a lot of players are still using Namor. So Namor would be the alternative here with the exact same lead and the exact same support. But yes, Dr. Octopus does score the highest, although Namor is quite competitive in that regard. But other than Namor and Doc Ock, there's nobody. So Hulk is like a super distant third. Carnage is a super distant third. They just do not count. Back to no restrictions here. We've listed Black Bolt, but again, the same logic applies where you would use Jean Grey if you have a rage on her. Otherwise, you would use Black Bolt. So we're just going to do this here. We'll have, both of them set up, and you also have the Magneto team listed as an alternative. But just so people understand, it does matter what build you have, and it's kind of difficult to mention that without making this video, because otherwise it's confusing. You're like, oh, I should use Black Bolt on this day, but I should use Jean on that day. No. If you have Jean juiced to the tits, use her for all 3 days. But if you don't have Jean, then or you have her built for PvP, then of course Black Bolt is going to score better than her. Magneto is going to score higher than her, etc. Universal female hero, there's no competition here. It's Scarlet Witch. We now have an extra support, so you can drop the Captain Marvel and just use Angela. That just basically dominates the day. There's no competition whatsoever. No tier 4 Jean Grey with old uniform with a rage does not compete with Scarlet Witch. No, unfortunately not. Female villain, it's Jean again. In this case, it doesn't matter what your build is on Jean. As long as she's tier 4, she's going to be the best. Now, we do have a new support with Enchantress, but you can also use Proxima if no Enchantress. So you can use Proxima support if you don't have Enchantress. I think Enchantress is better than Proxima, but Proxima is an option in case you don't have Enchantress for whatever reason. But yeah, Jean, regardless of the build, is #1 here. There's no question whatsoever. Even with a greed CTP, she scores well above 12 million. So you do have that to look forward to. Speed hero female, you want to go back and use Misty now instead of Wave. You can use Wave as an alternative, but Misty is better. And then again, same logic applies. Luna is best, then Spider-Gwen, then Gamora, then a little bit further down, you have Shadow Shell. Combat female actually is the other day that didn't change. Hasn't changed at all, along with Moon Knight and that other day. Has not changed whatsoever. All three need a rage if you want the high score. However, I think it's pretty close if you give Valkyrie like a brilliant insight or a mighty insight, and that makes her more flexible as a support for other things like Moon Knight ABX and stuff like that. So maybe it's better to do that. But you absolutely need a rage on She-Hulk and Titania. There's no debate about that. There's no question about that. Speed villain, it's Green Goblin's day now. He can work with a rage or judgment. Rage or judgment for Green Goblin works, which is great. So you do have options here. One of the only days where that is the case, right? Almost every other day, pretty much every other day, you need a rage, except if you don't have an option for your female villain, but you're using Jean. But for Green Goblin, yeah, judgment works very, very well. So that is ABX. On the ABL side of things, and of course, you also need to keep in mind that for some of these days, there is overlap. So you want to be careful. Like, for example, on No Restriction Day, when it's Blast Male Villain, you don't want to use your Magneto team for ABX if you're then going to use Magneto for Blast Male Villain. So I can't really illustrate that in the spreadsheet. You have to just sort of use your noggin there. But that is something to keep in mind because you can otherwise screw yourself over by using up characters before they're available, like, you know, when you have to use them again. So just keep that in mind. Look ahead on the schedule in game to see. Like, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're probably screwed. But just to show you one more time here, when you look at the schedule, on certain days you're going to have overlap depending on what you're going for. So with the no restrictions, right, if you use, sorry, like here, if there's no restrictions and then you use the character that you were going to use, the hero alien or whoever it is, then you're not going to have that character, right? Or for example, you know, does that make sense? So you just have to, like here, for example, it's no restriction, like I was saying, and then it's Blast Villain Male. So there is a Magneto team that's very good for no restriction if you don't have Jean Rage and you don't have Black Bolt. But then if you use Magneto for ABX, you can't use Magneto for ABL, and then you're going to see a massive drop off in your score, right? So you just have to sort of balance those in your mind, and you're going to have to build multiple of these sort of best teams. For ABL, it's pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to go through it in as much depth. But Luna, Speed Human Female with Misty Knight. Magneto, now you take advantage of ABL with old Cyclops Phoenix 5 and Mysterio. You can't use Enchantress here because it's males. But yeah. And then you can also use Mysterio as a DPS if you don't have Magneto. But of course, if you have Magneto, obviously use him. But yeah, Mysterio is the second best now. And then, you know, Mephisto and old Iron Man are like a distant third for those people wondering. No restriction for ABL. Same logic here. If you have Rage Jean, go ahead and use her. If you don't have Rage Jean, then Black Bolt becomes an excellent option. So consider using him there. And he's listed as the alternative team, but yeah, he's down there. I was going to copy and paste his face, but no, we're not going to do that. So yeah, the Rage Jean, you know, very, very good, but also a bit niche in my opinion, considering there are the game modes. Universal Female ABL, it's Jean Grey again. If you have her with a Rage. If you don't have her with a Rage and you have her with a Greed, then it becomes a bit of a toss-up between Jean and Scarlet Witch. So you may need to do a little bit of testing. Just keep in mind the strikers are completely different for ABL Universal Female. Jean as a villain can leverage Morgan and Proxima. Scarlet Witch as a hero cannot. I mean, she can leverage Morgan, but she's better off with Phyla-Vell and Angela, I believe, or maybe it's Morgan and Angela. I'm not 100% sure. It might be Morgan and Angela, but certainly Angela instead of Proxima. So just keep that in mind. Human female, you have a couple of options here for lead now because it's not locked in on speed types. So you can still use Misty lead, or you can use Wave, but she's a distant third. But then you can also use She-Hulk. So experiment between She-Hulk and Misty Knight to see which one is performing better for you with Luna. And then, of course, you have other options here. You have alternate leads. You have alternate teams with Spider-Gwen or Shadow Shell. Not as good as Luna, but they can still score decently well. But we're talking like a couple million behind the de facto queen. Combat villain male ABL now. Dr. Octopus clearly in the lead. You can certainly use Namor and just substitute Namor in where you see Dr. Octopus, but he is a bit of a distant second to Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus is very, very strong. The last Hero Mutant Day, bit of controversy or sort of a disagreement in the community. Some people think Professor X tends to score higher on average than Storm. Some people prefer Storm. So there is a debate here, but it's essentially the exact same team. You just sub out Professor X and Storm. It depends on who you play better with. It depends on who you have tier 4. It depends on quite a few different factors. But yeah, those are the two teams, but I listed the one that I believe to be the highest scoring in Professor X. Speed female, you want to use Misty lead, but then again, you can substitute to Wave, but there are no other options because you can't use Nick. Oh, actually, you can use... No, you can't use Nick. It's speed female. So you can't use Nick, and you can't use She-Hulk. Alien hero male. This one's a bit of a toss-up. If you have Star-Lord, you want to pair him with Groot and Rocket for best, highest possible score. However, if you don't have Star-Lord, you can build either tier 4 Odin or tier 4 Thor. Now, this was the only day that Thor appeared, so he's not valuable for ABX ABL otherwise, except as a striker. And we'll talk about that at the end, but yes, he is the best generic striker for tier 4 for ABX. Or ABL, sorry, so that is valuable. But in terms of who's going to be doing the most damage, it is Star-Lord, and then it is Odin, I believe. Or they're very, very close. They're neck and neck, but Star-Lord's cheaper than Odin, so I would give the edge to Star-Lord. But just keep that in mind. You sort of have a couple of options there. You got Star-Lord at the top, then a little bit further down Odin, and then a lot further down you have Thor tier 4. No restriction, same logic as before. Jean if it rage, Black Bolt if no rage. Hero mutant female we talked about hasn't changed whatsoever. Alien villain, we're talking about Thanos now. Thanos is your main DPS and lead. Yes, Thanos. That's crazy. I know, Farmer Thanos. This one's tough. There's not a lot of good options in alien villain category if you do not have Thanos. So I know this is a seasonal uniform, which makes it much rarer. But if you don't have Thanos, you're basically looking at a list that looks something like this. It's brutal. Alien, Universal, well, it's not Universal, but Alien Villain, there's just not that many options. Changing it from Universal to non-Universal didn't add anything good. So basically your other options are you could try with Enchantress to see what her score is like. I don't know if anyone tested that, but I imagine it's not very good, but she's still an excellent support for that day, so you want to pick her up regardless. Then your best bet is probably to go Loki. But yeah, I didn't even list the Loki team here because it's so far away from Thanos, unless you have an absolutely Giga Chad Loki with like a brilliant rage or a brilliant destruction or some shit like that, and you play perfectly, but it's a very small pool of players that can do that, so it's not really worth mentioning. And if you want to investigate that, then you should go and check out those channels and talk to those players directly, because I don't have that much knowledge. I was never that good with Loki. Universal Male is Black Bolt's day. He's the lead and the DPS, and then you use Thanos for the team-up bonus and Ghost Panther for the support, and then you use Thanos to cancel when you can't use Black Bolt. And then finally we come to Combat Human Male, where you use Dr. Octopus or Namor if you don't have him. Now, final thing I want to say here is best generic striker. So I didn't really talk too much about the strikers that you need to use in order to cancel. That's, you know, something that's it's a bit too nuanced, and it doesn't really help players out in my opinion, because they're still going to need to figure out how to play the character, and that comes first before the canceling. So if you're just looking for the best damage increase, right? If you have tier 4s and you're trying to jump into ABX or ABL and you're trying to increase your score ASAP, and you're not worried about canceling because your character cancels or whatever, then the best striker, the best tier 4 striker to just get more points in ABX is actually Black Widow, believe it or not. Even if the tier 4 you're using doesn't have synergy with Black Widow. right? Even if they don't have the same instinct. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. And then the same goes for Thor. Even for characters that do not have the same instinct, Thor is the best tier 4 striker if you just want more points in ABL, with one exception. There is one exception and only one exception, and that is our good friend Black Bolt. For Black Bolt, there's only one striker, whether you're using Black Bolt for ABX or ABL or both. There's only one striker for Black Bolt. Say it with me now, it's Cable. That's it. That's all you gotta know. Just set it to Cable and never change it. It's Cable. And it's about to get even stronger because he's going to get a tier 4. Anywho, hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what you think of the new ABX ABL list. Hopefully I've inspired some people to try to push to new heights. Thank you so much for watching. Smash the like button. It helps out the channel. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care.